On the morning of December 19, 1944, a German Oberst crouched in a shattered farmhouse 3 miles south of Bastogne, trying to understand what he was seeing. His battalion had just overrun an American aid station during the opening days of the Ardennes offensive. The captured medical supplies lay scattered across blood-stained snow. Morphine syrettes by the dozen. Sulfur powder in quantities his unit hadn't seen in months. Plasma bottles still frozen solid. Bandages so white they seemed to glow against the filth of combat. But it was the penicillin that made him stop. Small vials of yellowish powder, dozens of them, marked with American pharmaceutical codes. His own medical pouches contained sulfur drugs that had been in short supply since Stalingrad. The Americans were using this at the battalion level. At the front, the German doctor picked up one of the vials and turned it slowly in his fingers. His medical training told him what this meant. His combat experience told him what it would cost. The Americans had turned infection into a manageable wound. They had taken away the invisible killer that claimed more soldiers than bullets. They had changed the mathematics of attrition in ways his commanders did not yet understand. Or perhaps worse, in ways they understood perfectly but could not admit. This is the story of what German commanders really thought about the American combat medic system during World War II. Not what they said in official reports, but what they whispered in prisoner of war camps, what they wrote in private journals, what they confronted every time they saw the survival rates of soldiers who should have died. The American medical evacuation chain was not supposed to exist. It violated every principle of mobile warfare the Wehrmacht had perfected. It required resources the Germans could no longer spare. It worked with a ruthless efficiency that terrified men who prided themselves on efficiency. And when German officers finally grasped what they were facing, many chose to look away rather than confront the implications. Because acknowledging the American medical advantage meant acknowledging something far more dangerous. It meant admitting the war was already lost. The first serious clash between German forces and the full American medical apparatus came in North Africa during 1943. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been fighting the British 8th Army for 2 years. He understood their medical system. He respected it. The British field hospitals were professional, their evacuation procedures sound, their treatment of German prisoners correct. But the British were fighting at the edge of a logistics chain that stretched back to Alexandria. They moved slowly. They conserved resources. They could be predicted. The Americans were different. Major Dieter Graf commanded a battalion of the 10th Panzer Division when American forces first engaged his unit near Kasserine Pass in February of 1943. In a letter to his wife written 3 weeks after the battle, he described watching American medics work between the lines during a temporary ceasefire. What struck him was not their courage. German medics were equally brave. It was the equipment they carried. Each American medic seemed to have more medical supplies than Graf's entire battalion aid station. The morphine alone would have lasted his unit for weeks. They moved with what he called a careless abundance, treating wounds with handfuls of sulfur powder that German medics applied in careful pinches. More troubling were the jeep ambulances. Graf counted 16 vehicles marked with red crosses evacuating casualties from a single American battalion sector. His entire division possessed 11 ambulances, and 3 were broken down awaiting parts that would never arrive. The Americans treated evacuation like assembly line production. Wounded soldiers moved from the front to battalion aid stations in minutes, not hours. From aid stations to field hospitals in jeeps that bounced across the desert at speeds that would have killed German casualties lying on horse-drawn wagons. And the Americans did this routinely. Every day. For every wounded man. Graf's letter contained a single line that his wife preserved after the war. They are spending more effort to save one soldier than we spend to capture an objective. But the true revelation came later, when Graf was wounded by American artillery on March 22 and captured 4 days afterward near El Gueta. He spent 2 months in an American prisoner of war facility in Algeria before being transferred to the United States. During those 2 months, he saw firsthand what American military medicine actually meant. The facility where Graf recovered was a tent hospital erected 10 miles behind the front lines. It held 400 beds. 2 complete surgical teams worked in shifts around the clock. The hospital received casualties by ambulance from division clearing stations and evacuated recovered patients by hospital ship to Iran for further treatment or repatriation. What stunned Graf was the mortality rate. Of the 400 patients in the facility, perhaps 20 died during his 2-month stay. 5%. And many of those deaths were men who arrived already beyond saving. Infection, the invisible killer that haunted every German field hospital, rarely claimed victims. Wounds that would have required amputation in German facilities healed with aggressive surgical debridement and new medications. Men who would have died from shock survived because of immediate plasma transfusions. Graf watched American doctors perform surgery on German prisoners with the same intensity they applied to American casualties. No favoritism. No deliberate neglect. The Geneva Convention observed not because of oversight but because the Americans had resources to spare. In his post-war memoir, published in 1952, Graf wrote about the moment he understood what he was witnessing. An American surgeon, Captain Robert Morris from Ohio, had just finished operating on a young Panzer Grenadier with severe abdominal wounds. The boy would live. Morris washed his hands and explained through an interpreter that the soldier had arrived in shock, nearly dead. 4 units of plasma and immediate surgery had stabilized him. The wound showed no signs of infection because they had used this new drug, penicillin. It killed bacteria so effectively that postoperative sepsis had become rare. Graf asked how much penicillin the hospital possessed. Morris gave him a look that the German officer remembered decades later. A look of polite confusion, as if the question made no sense. "As much as we need," Morris said. "We order it. It arrives." That was the moment Graf realized the war was already over. The American advantage in combat medicine began long before soldiers reached field hospitals. It started at the moment of wounding, with medics who operated under doctrines so different from German practice they seemed to come from a different war entirely. German medical doctrine, developed during the 1930s and refined on the Eastern Front, emphasized speed and efficiency. The sanitator, the frontline medic, carried enough supplies to stabilize casualties for transport. His job was triage. Determine who could survive evacuation, move them to the Truppenverbenplatz battalion aid station, and return to the line. The system worked when the Wehrmacht was advancing, when casualties were light, when logistics functioned. It collapsed under the conditions of total war. By 1943, German medics often operated with equipment shortages that made American abundance seem almost obscene. Morphine was rationed. Sulfur drugs were in short supply. Bandages were reused until they fell apart. Plasma did not exist in quantities that mattered. The Truppenverbenplatz, the battalion aid point where initial surgery occurred, might consist of a single doctor with surgical instruments that had not been properly sterilized for weeks. The German military medical system assumed casualties would be evacuated quickly to rear areas where proper facilities existed. But those facilities were hundreds of miles away, and the transportation network was under constant air attack. Wounded soldiers died not from their injuries but from infections that developed during the days it took to reach a hospital. The Americans built their system differently. Each infantry company had medical aid men who stayed with the platoons. 4 to 6 medics per company, armed only with faith in the Geneva Convention and a willingness to run toward gunfire rather than away from it. They carried aid bags that weighed 30 pounds, packed with morphine syrettes, sulfur powder, bandages, plasma, and after mid-1944, penicillin. Their training emphasized immediate treatment. Stop the bleeding. Prevent shock. Stabilize for evacuation. Behind them came the battalion aid station, typically established a few hundred yards behind the front line. Here, medical officers performed initial assessment and urgent treatment. Not surgery, not yet, but rapid stabilization to make men transportable. Jeep ambulances, each capable of carrying 4-liter patients or 7 walking wounded, evacuated casualties to collection points where division clearing stations sorted them by severity. The clearing stations fed casualties to field hospitals, mobile surgical units positioned 5 to 15 miles behind the front. These hospitals could break down and relocate in hours, yet functioned with the capability of civilian facilities. They performed major surgery, treated for shock, prevented infection. Survival rates at American field hospitals exceeded 85%. Men operated on at these facilities survived wounds that would have killed them in any previous war. And beyond the field hospitals lay an entire infrastructure dedicated to moving wounded soldiers away from combat. Hospital trains. Hospital ships. Transport aircraft modified with litter racks and staffed by flight nurses. By 1944, 18% of American casualties were being evacuated by air. The entire system, from point of wounding to stateside hospital, functioned as a single integrated machine. A soldier wounded in France could be in England within hours, in the United States within 2 weeks. The mortality rate for American soldiers who reached medical care was 4%. 4 soldiers died for every 96 who survived. For comparison, the mortality rate in World War I had been 8%. The rate during the Civil War had been 25%. The Americans had not merely improved battlefield medicine. They had revolutionized it. But here is what truly separated the American system from the German. The American medical chain was designed to handle everyone. Every single wounded soldier, regardless of severity, regardless of rank, regardless of whether his injury seemed trivial or catastrophic. The system consumed massive resources. It required thousands of trained personnel. It demanded logistics networks that transported medical supplies as priority cargo. It cost money and vehicles and fuel that could have been used for offensive operations. And the Americans built it anyway. Because to them, the calculation was simple. A soldier who survived his wounds could return to duty. A soldier who died could not. Medical care was not charity. It was force preservation. The Germans understood this intellectually, but they could not match it practically. By the time American forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Wehrmacht was fighting with a medical system designed for a short war of movement. The Americans arrived with a medical system designed to keep an army in the field indefinitely. Colonel Hans von Luck commanded the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign. He survived the war and published his memoirs in 1989. In them, he described the moment he realized the Americans possessed advantages that could not be overcome by tactical brilliance or soldier quality. It happened on June 9, 3 days after the invasion, when von Luck's reconnaissance unit overran a temporary American aid station near St. Mireglise. The facility consisted of 3 large tents marked with red crosses. Inside, his men found 26 wounded American paratroopers receiving treatment from 2 doctors and 8 medics. What struck von Luck was the state of the wounded. Men with severe injuries lay on proper cots with intravenous lines running plasma directly into their veins. The plasma came from bottles marked with American Red Cross labels, hundreds of them, stored in a refrigerated truck that ran on a portable generator. The Americans were using refrigeration at a battalion aid station. Von Luck's division medical company did not possess refrigeration. The Wehrmacht had to rely on ambient temperature storage for the limited blood supplies they managed to transport forward. And the Americans had so much plasma they could administer it freely at the point of first contact. One of von Luck's officers, a former medical student named Rolf Steiner, examined the captured supplies and equipment. He found surgical instruments still sterile in their packaging, medications in quantities that seemed wasteful, and vials of what the labels identified as penicillin hydrochloride. Steiner knew what penicillin was. German medical journals had carried reports about British success with the drug since 1942. But Germany had failed to manufacture it in militarily significant quantities. The Reich's pharmaceutical industry had bet on sulfonamides, drugs they could produce easily. They were effective against some infections. They were not effective enough. The Americans had penicillin at the battalion level. That implied a production capacity so vast that Steiner struggled to comprehend it. You don't deploy a wonder drug to frontline medical stations unless you have so much of it that logistics become trivial. Later that same week, von Luck was wounded by American artillery and evacuated to a German field hospital near Falaise. He spent 6 days there before being transferred to Paris for surgery on shrapnel wounds in his left leg and shoulder. The contrast haunted him. The German facility was professionally run and adequately equipped. The doctors did excellent work under difficult circumstances. But supplies were short. Morphine was rationed strictly. The surgery used instruments that had been sterilized by boiling because the autoclaves were broken. Infection rates were climbing because they lacked sufficient quantities of even the sulfur drugs they could produce. Von Luck's memoir described watching a young soldier die of sepsis 4 days after successful surgery to repair a compound leg fracture. The wound had been clean. The surgery had been skillful. But infection set in anyway, and there was no penicillin to stop it. The soldier's name was Wilhelm Kessler, 19 years old, from a farm outside of Munich. He died screaming. "I kept thinking about those American paratroopers," von Luck wrote. "The ones my men had captured. They were in American hospitals in England by then, recovering with medications we could not provide to our own wounded. I thought about Kessler, who should have lived. Who would have lived if he had been American? That is when I understood we were not fighting a war we could win through courage or skill or determination. We were fighting an industrial system that could afford to save every soldier while we had to choose which ones to let die." The secret recordings made at Trent Park in England and Fort Hunt in the United States captured German officers discussing the American medical system with a frankness they never showed in official reports. These men did not know their conversations were being recorded. They spoke freely about their observations, their frustrations, their grudging admiration. In February of 1945, General Ludwig Krühl, captured in North Africa in 1942, discussed American medical capabilities with General Heinrich Eberbach, who had commanded the 5th Panzer Army in Normandy. The recording of their conversation runs for 37 minutes. In it, Krühl describes treating captured American medics in Libya with professional respect because they had better medical training than many of our doctors. Eberbach responds with an observation about wounded Americans he had seen during his capture. "They all had these little packages," Eberbach said. "The medics carried them. Individual first aid packets. Every single soldier had one. Morphine in a disposable syringe, sulfur powder, bandage, all in a waterproof package small enough to fit in a pocket. We were still using individual dressings from the last war." Krühl laughed, but it was the laugh of a man finding dark humor in catastrophe. "They had morphine syringes," he said. "Single use. Throw it away after. We were breaking morphine ampules and hoping to get 3 uses from 1 dose by reusing the needle." The conversation continued. Both generals agreed that American medical superiority had psychological effects beyond the physical care it provided. German soldiers who witnessed American medics working began to question whether their own leadership valued their lives as much as the Americans valued theirs. Surrender became more attractive when you knew American captivity meant better medical care than German field hospitals could provide. Eberbach mentioned an incident in Normandy where his staff intercepted American radio traffic between a battalion aid station and a field hospital. The Americans were evacuating a German prisoner with severe wounds. The battalion surgeon wanted permission to use 3 units of whole blood for transfusion. The field hospital commander approved without hesitation. 3 units of whole blood. For an enemy combatant. "We could not have done that for one of our own colonels," Eberbach said. The recording captured 11 seconds of silence before Krühl responded. "That's why we lost." Not losing. Lost. Past tense. In February of 1945, 2 months before Germany's surrender. Another recording, this one from June of 1945 at Fort Hunt, captured General Major Kurt Dittmar discussing American logistics with General Major Franz von Papen, son of the former German Chancellor. Both had been captured in the final weeks of the war. Dittmar had observed American operations extensively and was considered an expert on enemy capabilities. Their medical system was part of their logistics system, Dittmar explained. They treated wounded soldiers like ammunition or fuel, a resource to be recovered and reused. We treated our wounded like casualties, a cost of operations. The difference in philosophy was everything. Von Papen asked what Dittmar meant. "I'll tell you," Dittmar said. At Bastogne, the American division surrounded there had no ground evacuation. They used cargo aircraft to fly in supplies and fly out wounded. Cargo aircraft. As if wounded soldiers were more important than bullets. And those aircraft delivered plasma and whole blood on the return trip. Their air force transported blood. We could never have organized that. We would not have thought to try. But the Americans had a system that valued each soldier enough to spend aircraft and fuel and trained pilots on medical evacuation. That tells you how wealthy they were, yes, but more importantly, it tells you how they thought about their army. As an investment to be protected. The recording continued for several more minutes, but von Papen never responded to that observation. What could he say? The fundamental difference was philosophical before it became material. Americans built a military that treated soldiers as valuable assets worth recovering. Germans built a military that accepted casualties as inevitable costs. Both approaches had logic. Only one had the resources to implement that logic effectively. And only one created a feedback loop where saved soldiers became experienced veterans who made armies more effective, which saved more soldiers, which created more veterans. The American medical system was not just humanitarian. It was strategically brilliant. The Germans saw this. They discussed it. They could not match it. And eventually, they stopped trying to pretend it did not matter. The Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944 brought the American medical system to its breaking point. The German offensive shattered American front lines and isolated entire divisions. Medical units were overrun, captured, or forced to evacuate in chaos. Wounded soldiers accumulated at aid stations that could not evacuate them. Field hospitals came under direct attack. For the first time since North Africa, the American medical chain broke down. This should have been Germany's opportunity to demonstrate the superior flexibility of their lighter medical system. It was not. The Wehrmacht's final major offensive of the war revealed how thoroughly their medical capabilities had deteriorated. By late 1944, German divisions in the West operated with medical companies at less than 60% strength. Vehicle shortages meant most casualties were evacuated by horse-drawn wagon or not at all. Medications were severely rationed. Surgical instruments were worn to the point of failure. Penicillin remained unavailable except in tiny quantities looted from captured American supplies. When the offensive began on December 16, German forces advanced rapidly through the Ardennes forest. They overran American positions and captured hundreds of prisoners, including many wounded soldiers and medical personnel. The treatment of those prisoners varied wildly. Some German commanders respected the Geneva Convention and provided medical care. Others did not. At Malmedy on December 17, SS troops executed 84 American prisoners of war, including medics wearing Red Cross armbands. The massacre violated every principle of military law. It was a war crime that would lead to post-war trials and executions. But it was also tactically idiotic. The Americans publicized the massacre within days. It destroyed any possibility of American soldiers surrendering readily. It guaranteed that American forces would fight with the desperation of men who knew they might be murdered if captured. It made every subsequent German advance more costly in casualties. Those casualties overwhelmed German medical capabilities almost immediately. Oberst Herbert Meyer commanded a field replacement battalion attached to the 2nd Panzer Division during the Bulge. His post-war interrogation reports, declassified in 1983, provide a German perspective on the medical crisis that developed. By December 20th, we had accumulated over 400 wounded at the regimental aid post, Meyer reported. The division surgeon had one ambulance. 1. We were using captured American jeeps to evacuate casualties to the Hauptverbanplatz 15 kilometers behind the line. But the roads were under constant air attack. Many wounded died during transport from injuries that should not have been fatal. Meyer described the frustration of German medical personnel who knew their American counterparts were operating with resources they could only dream of. We captured an American aid station near Hufeleis, he said. The supplies they had abandoned would have equipped our entire division for weeks. Plasma, morphine, surgical supplies, all left behind because the Americans knew they would receive fresh supplies within hours. We could not comprehend that level of abundance. But even as German forces advanced through the Ardennes, their own casualties mounted faster than their medical system could handle. The Wehrmacht's dream of capturing American supply depots and using those resources to sustain the offensive died in the frozen forests. American forces denied the Germans those stockpiles. And when German wounded piled up at aid stations that lacked vehicles, medications, and personnel to treat them, the reality became inescapable. The bulge was not demonstrating German flexibility. It was exposing German desperation. At Bastogne, the surrounded American forces demonstrated what their medical system could do even under the worst possible conditions. The 101st Airborne Division's medical company had been largely captured on December 19 when German forces overran their aid station. The division was left with minimal medical personnel and dwindling supplies. No ground evacuation was possible. German artillery pounded the town constantly. American casualties accumulated faster than the remaining medics could treat them. Then the weather cleared on December 23. American transport aircraft began dropping supplies by parachute. Among those supplies were medical bundles, plasma, whole blood, penicillin, morphine, surgical instruments. Enough to keep the medical stations functioning despite the siege. Surgical teams flew into Bastogne by glider to reinforce the overwhelmed aid stations. One surgeon performed 15 surgical procedures in 36 hours straight. Between December 19 and December 26, when Patton's Third Army finally broke through to relieve the siege, medical teams in Bastogne treated 943 American casualties and 125 German prisoners. The American system had not broken. It had adapted. German prisoners wounded in the fighting around Bastogne received the same aggressive treatment as American casualties. Plasma, penicillin, immediate surgery when needed. They recovered in American facilities while their comrades died of infection in German aid stations 20 miles away. Some German prisoners later testified that American medics saved their lives when their own medical service would have left them to die from wounds or subsequent infection. This created a psychological problem that German commanders could not address. How do you maintain morale when your soldiers know that enemy captivity offers better medical care than your own field hospitals? The answer, by late 1944, was that you could not. German soldiers increasingly viewed surrender to American forces as preferable to evacuation through their own medical system. The disparity had become too obvious to ignore. The final German assessment came in the spring of 1945, as the Reich collapsed. Wehrmacht medical personnel interviewed by American intelligence officers after the surrender spoke with remarkable candor about the advantages they had witnessed. A German surgeon identified only as Dr. K in intelligence reports described treating captured American medics in March of 1945 near the Rhine. The Americans had been captured when their battalion aid station was overrun. Dr. K examined their medical bags. Each medic carried more morphine than my entire company had available, he said. They had plasma in individual packets that could be administered in the field. They had sulfur in quantities we had not seen since 1942. And they had this penicillin that we had heard about but never possessed in meaningful amounts. Dr. K asked one of the American medics how much training he had received. The medic replied that he had completed 12 weeks of medical training before deployment, followed by additional on-the-job instruction. 12 weeks. Dr. K noted that German sanitators typically received 4 weeks of training. The Americans invested 3 times as much training in their frontline medical personnel. They could afford to because they had the instructors, the facilities, and the time. Germany could afford none of these by 1945. But it was another comment from the captured American medic that stayed with Dr. K. The medic mentioned that if he was wounded, he expected to survive. Not hoped. Expected. The American medical system had created such confidence in its effectiveness that frontline soldiers believed they would survive their wounds. German soldiers by 1945 had no such confidence. They knew that wounds which would have been survivable early in the war were now death sentences. Infection rates climbed. Evacuation systems broke down. Medications vanished. The gap between American and German military medicine had become a chasm. The statistical reality supported this perception. By war's end, the American military had treated approximately 16 million cases of disease and injury. The mortality rate for soldiers who reached medical treatment remained at 4% throughout the war. 4 men died for every 96 who survived. The German mortality rate is difficult to calculate precisely because their record-keeping system collapsed in the final year of the war. But estimates based on available data suggest mortality rates for wounded German soldiers who reached medical facilities climbed from approximately 6% in 1942 to over 15% by 1945. The difference was not surgical skill. German surgeons were highly trained and professionally competent. The difference was systemic. The Americans had built a medical machine that functioned under all conditions. The Germans had built a system that worked only when the war was going well. By 1945, the war had not been going well for Germany for a very long time. General Major Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff, was captured in May of 1945 and interrogated extensively by American intelligence. In one session recorded on June 8, 1945, he discussed the factors that led to Germany's defeat. Among them, he listed the American medical system. "You treated your soldiers as valuable assets to be preserved," Warlimont said. "We treated ours as expendable resources to be consumed. Both approaches have logic in total war. But your approach created a feedback loop. Saved soldiers became experienced veterans. Experienced veterans made your army more effective. A more effective army saved more soldiers. We could not match that cycle. By 1944, many of your infantry units contained men who had survived multiple wounds and returned to combat. Our infantry units contained teenagers with 8 weeks training. The difference was decisive." Warlimont's assessment echoes through the historical record. The American combat medic system was not merely humanitarian. It was strategically brilliant. Each medic who pulled a wounded soldier from the battlefield potentially saved a trained combatant who would fight again. Each battalion aid station that stabilized casualties for evacuation prevented the loss of skills and experience that took months to develop. Each field hospital that treated for infection and shock preserved manpower that could not be easily replaced. The Germans understood this intellectually. Their military theorists had written about the importance of medical care in sustaining combat effectiveness. But understanding and implementing are different things. Implementation requires resources, organization, logistics, and most importantly, the fundamental belief that each individual soldier matters enough to spend those resources saving him. The American military operated with that belief. The German military did not. Or more accurately, could not. By the time German commanders fully grasped the implications of American medical superiority, it was too late to respond. The resources needed to build a comparable system did not exist. The industrial capacity had been bombed. The transportation network had been destroyed. The medications could not be manufactured in sufficient quantities. The war had already been lost. But the knowledge remained. In post-war interrogations, in private memoirs published decades later, in recorded conversations between veterans, the same themes appear repeatedly. The Americans had more. More plasma. More penicillin. More vehicles. More doctors. More organization. More of everything that mattered in keeping soldiers alive. And they used those resources with a systematic efficiency that German officers both admired and feared. One final conversation, recorded at a German veterans gathering in Munich in 1973, captures this acknowledgement. 3 former Wehrmacht medical officers were discussing their wartime experiences. The conversation was recorded by a German documentary filmmaker and later archived. One of the doctors, identified as Dr. Heinrich Müller, described treating German wounded in a field hospital in France in August of 1944. "We did our best with what we had," Müller said. "But what we had was never enough. I watched soldiers die from wounds that American doctors would have considered routine. Die from infections that penicillin would have prevented. Die from shock that plasma would have reversed. And I knew. We all knew. The Americans had beaten us not just in tanks and planes but in something more fundamental. They had beaten us in the value they placed on their soldiers' lives." His colleague, Dr. Franz Weber, responded. That was their secret weapon. Not the penicillin itself, though that mattered. Not the plasma, though that saved thousands. Their secret weapon was the belief that every soldier deserved to be saved. We never had that belief. Or if we had it, we lost it somewhere between Poland and Stalingrad. The third doctor said nothing. The recording shows 8 seconds of silence before the conversation moved to other topics. But that silence speaks volumes. What can you say when confronted with a truth that painful? The American combat medic system represented everything the Wehrmacht had failed to become. A military that valued its soldiers enough to spend vast resources preserving them. An industrial system capable of producing medications in quantities that made waste acceptable. A logistics network that could move medical supplies with the same priority as ammunition. An organizational structure that integrated medical care into every level of combat operations. The Germans had lost the war in many ways. On battlefields. In factories. In the air. But they had also lost it in aid stations and field hospitals, where American medics saved soldiers who would fight again while German medics watched their wounded die from preventable causes. This was the assessment German commanders feared to voice during the war. That the American advantage was not merely material but philosophical. That the Americans had built a military system based on preserving human life while Germany had built one based on expending it. That this difference, multiplied across millions of casualties over 6 years of war, had created an inexorable advantage that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The German officers who survived the war carried this knowledge with them. Some wrote about it in memoirs. Some discussed it in recorded conversations. Some took it to their graves without speaking of it publicly. But the knowledge was there. In 1945, when everything lay in ruins and the cost of Germany's choices became undeniable, even the proudest commanders had to confront what they had always known but never admitted. The Americans had won not just through greater production or superior technology, but through something more fundamental. They had won because they believed their soldiers' lives were worth saving. And they had built the most sophisticated medical system in military history to prove it. That system saved hundreds of thousands of American lives. It treated millions of casualties. It returned experienced soldiers to combat. It maintained morale by assuring troops they would not be abandoned if wounded. It demonstrated American industrial and organizational superiority in the most human terms possible. And it terrified German commanders who understood what it represented. A war machine that could afford to value individual human life. An enemy so wealthy in resources and so advanced in organization that saving every wounded soldier became not just possible but routine. A force that treated combat medicine not as an afterthought but as a strategic priority equal to firepower and mobility. The German fear was justified. The American combat medic system helped win World War II. Not through dramatic battlefield rescues, though those occurred constantly. Not through individual heroism, though medics displayed extraordinary courage. But through the systematic, relentless, efficient preservation of military manpower on an industrial scale. 4% mortality for casualties who reached treatment. 16 million cases treated. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers saved who would have died in any previous war. Experience preserved. Skills maintained. Morale sustained. That was the advantage German commanders feared. That was the system they could never match. And that was the reality they finally had to admit, in private conversations and recorded interrogations, when the war ended and truth could no longer be avoided. The Americans had built a better way to wage war. Not more brutal. More humane. And that humanity, organized and systematized and supported with the full weight of American industrial might, proved decisive. The medics who crawled through fire to reach wounded soldiers, who set up aid stations in shelled buildings, who performed surgery by candlelight, who evacuated casualties through enemy fire, never saw themselves as strategic assets. They were just doing their jobs. Saving lives. Following their training. Refusing to abandon wounded men. But their work, multiplied across every battlefield from North Africa to the Rhine, created a military advantage that Germany could not counter. That was what German commanders really thought about the American combat medic system. They thought it was brilliant. They thought it was unbeatable. And they were right. If you found this deep dive into World War II military history compelling, we'd truly appreciate your support. Please like this video to help share these untold stories with others who value accurate historical accounts. And subscribe to stay connected with our community as we continue exploring the human stories behind the greatest conflict in history. These narratives matter, and your engagement helps keep them alive for future generations who need to understand not just what happened, but why it mattered.